Hello, my name's Darvell. My father called me one night, his voice cold as stone. I sold the $12 million estate. You'll get nothing. That was it. No thank you, no memory, no place at his table. Just a lifetime erased in a single phone call. But here's the part he never saw coming. Buried in the shadows of that estate, my mother left me something he couldn't sell, couldn't steal, couldn't erase. And when I told him you forgot one thing, his face went pale. So what was it? That's the story I'm about to tell you. The evening sun was slipping behind the buildings outside my window when the phone rang. My apartment sat on the edge of a busy street not far from the industrial park. It was small, plain, and mine alone. I had a single armchair that sagged where the fabric had worn thin, a coffee table scratched from years of use, and an old bookshelf stacked with paperbacks. Compared to the estate where I'd spent half my life working, this place was almost bare. Yet it was where I came back each night after long shifts, where I kept my quiet routines. The phone startled me. My father never called. If he wanted something, he usually had one of my sisters relay the message. For a second, I wondered if something serious had happened. Maybe he was ill. My stomach nodded as I picked it up. His voice was calm, clipped, the same tone he used whenever he spoke to staff back at the estate. Darvell, I thought you should hear it from me. I sold the estate. Closing is tomorrow. You won't see a single cent. Goodbye. The words landed heavy, like a stone in my chest. I didn't answer right away. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, half convinced I had misheard. Dad, I finally said, my voice barely there. What are you talking about? That's Mom's. He cut me off. It's done. You've been dead weight long enough. There's nothing for you to inherit. Your sisters will get their share. You won't. Silence filled the line. I couldn't breathe. Years of mowing the orchards, repairing fences, balancing the books when the estate slipped into debt. Gone, dismissed like they had never happened. I swallowed, but the words wouldn't come. The hum of traffic outside my window filled the space between us. Then his voice sharpened, a cruel edge breaking through. Don't sulk. I left something for you. You'll get it tonight. Consider it a keepsake. The line went dead. I sat with the phone still pressed against my ear long after the call ended. My hands trembled. It wasn't just the estate. It was everything wrapped inside it. The memory of my mother, the summers I spent hauling stones to rebuild the wall along the orchard, the nights I stayed awake making sure the staff got paid when the accounts ran short. None of it mattered. He had wiped it away in one breath. Around 8 o'clock, the knock came. The mailman, working late, handed me a thin envelope with my father's handwriting scrawled across it. No letter inside, no explanation, only an old rusted car key, the kind that belonged to a vehicle long since scrapped, jagged with rust at the edges, useless. I turned it over in my hand under the lamp. The metal smelled of age and oil. I remembered that car, the beat-up sedan my father forced me to drive when I was in high school, the one he never fixed even though I worked weekends to keep gas in the tank. I drove it to haul tools back and forth while my sisters took the polished SUVs to school dances. He had laughed once and said, "Better you than me." Now, years later, he'd mailed me that same key as if to say, "This is all you are worth." I sat down at the table and stared at it. A wave of humiliation washed through me, burning hotter than the shock had. All those family dinners came flooding back, the way he'd introduced my sisters with pride, listing their accomplishments to guests. Then his voice would turn dry when it came to me. Darvell helps out around the place, he'd say, or worse, our disappointment, but we keep him busy. I clenched the key until the edges bit into my palm. Images tumbled in my head, climbing onto the roof in the middle of a storm to patch leaks, cutting weeds under the summer sun until my shirt clung to my back, handing over the last of my savings when the estate accounts threatened to bounce checks. None of it had ever earned me more than a nod, never once a thank you. And now this. I dropped the key onto the table and let it clatter. The sound echoed through the quiet apartment, sharp, final. My chest ached. For a moment I almost laughed because what else could I do? But beneath the bitterness, something stirred. A pulse I hadn't felt in years. I picked up the key again, held it in front of me, and whispered, "This is all I'm worth to you." The words didn't sound broken. They sounded steady, low, like a promise to myself more than a question for him. I slid the key into the top drawer of my desk. The drawer stuck a little, like it resisted the idea of swallowing something so heavy with meaning. When it shut, I knew one thing. I wouldn't let this end here. Tomorrow, my father would sit at his table, surrounded by people who believed I didn't matter. He thought this chapter was closed. He thought I would stay quiet. But as I looked around my modest apartment, I felt the weight in my chest shift. I wasn't just humiliated. I was angry. And anger, when it finally found its voice, could change everything. I knew the next family dinner would not just be a meal. It would be my trial. The week passed slowly, every day carrying me closer to the moment I would walk into that restaurant. Each night, I opened the drawer and looked at the rusted key. It sat there like a reminder that my father didn't just strip me of inheritance. He stripped me of acknowledgement. By Saturday, I pressed a clean shirt and polished shoes I hadn't worn in months. If I was going to be humiliated, at least I wouldn't hand them the satisfaction of looking unkempt. The restaurant was one of those polished places in Houston with chandeliers hanging too low and waiters who looked like they had rehearsed every smile. My siblings were already gathered when I walked in. Tailored suits, expensive jewelry, voices raised in polished laughter. I paused a moment before the host led me to my place. "Your seat's right here," the waiter said, pulling out a chair pressed against the wall near the swinging restroom doors. Every time a guest walked past, the air shifted. I sat down, my knees nearly brushing the doorframe. My sisters gave each other knowing looks, then went back to their wine. My father lifted his glass before the first course even arrived. To Yvette, whose vision made this possible, and to my children who supported me. His eyes swept the table, landing proudly on each of them, then resting longest on his new wife. Not once did he glance my way. I kept my hands in my lap, fingers pressing against the key I'd slipped into my pocket before leaving my apartment. The food came in waves, shrimp cocktails, salads, steak plates, but all I could taste was the dry bitterness of being invisible. A family friend leaned across the table at one point, looking at me with polite confusion. "And who's this?" he asked. Yvette smirked, her lipstick leaving a mark on the rim of her glass. "That's Darvel, the youngest. He's never really been part of the business." Laughter rippled across the table, light and careless. My father didn't correct her. One of my sisters chuckled, covering her mouth as if it were all harmless fun. I forced a smile, my throat tight, because I knew if I spoke too soon, it would come out raw. The evening dragged on, conversations flowing around me like I wasn't even there. I chewed my steak in silence, nodding when someone glanced my way, but otherwise invisible. Until my father leaned toward Yvette, voice dropping lower than the chatter around us. "The wire transfer will clear by Tuesday," he said. "No complications. Buyer already confirmed there's no need for other signatures." I froze. His words stuck to me harder than the insult about my place at the table. No other signatures. My hand tightened around the key in my pocket, the teeth of the metal pressing into my skin. Yvette whispered back, smug. "Good. The last thing we need is him slowing this down." I lowered my gaze, pretending to cut my food, but my mind was turning. They weren't just erasing me emotionally. They were sealing me out legally. Locking doors I had never been given a key to open. My pulse quickened, though I kept my face steady. The rest of the dinner blurred. Toasts, more laughter, my siblings talking about vacations they'd booked with money they hadn't even touched yet. My father bragged about the estate like he'd built it alone. Not a single mention of the summers I spent patching roofs, of the debts I paid to keep the place afloat. My name wasn't even a shadow in the room. When the dessert arrived, I lifted my glass. My voice was low, but it cut through their chatter. "Enjoy the meal. Tomorrow, you might choke on it." The table went still for a heartbeat, then broke into uneasy laughter. My father waved his hand as though I'd said something silly. Yvette leaned toward my sister and whispered something that made her snicker. They thought my words were empty, but as I drained the last of my wine, I knew better. I wasn't speaking for them. I was speaking for myself. The rusted key burned in my pocket, heavier than any gold inheritance could have been. They laughed at me that night, but laughter couldn't erase the one person they all forgot. My mother. Her presence lingered in the quiet corners of my life, in the faded pictures still tucked in drawers, in the handwriting on envelopes I never had the courage to open. When I got back to my apartment after the dinner, the city lights felt harsher than usual. Houston streets hummed with life outside, but inside my place, there was only silence. I dropped my jacket over the chair and sat at the small kitchen table. The smell of cologne and steak clung to me, but what really lingered was the echo of their laughter, the smirk on Yvette's face, the careless way my father had said my name, or rather, the way he hadn't. I stayed like that for a long while, elbows on the table, staring at the dim light above me. Eventually, I stood and went to the corner of my bedroom closet. There, stacked under old shoes and a folded blanket, were the boxes I hadn't touched in years. One was marked with ink that had almost faded to nothing, my mother's handwriting. It simply said, "For Darvel." I carried it back to the table, brushing away dust, my hands suddenly unsteady. The cardboard creaked as I opened the lid. On top was an envelope, cream-colored, edges curled with time. Her handwriting stretched across it, steady and deliberate. I sat for a moment before sliding my finger under the flap. The letter inside was written in the same hand that once signed my report cards, left notes in my lunchbox, or labeled jars in the pantry. "My dear boy," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to say these words. You always loved the estate, not for what it was worth, but for what it meant. I saw how you cared for it when no one else noticed. I believe one day you will be the one to keep it alive." The words blurred. I pressed the page flat, tracing the loops of her script as if they could anchor me to her. My chest tightened, grief swelling with a strange warmth. She had seen me. She had known. Under the letter were stacks of papers bound by an old rubber band. I pulled them out carefully. Receipts for roof shingles, canceled checks for property taxes, bank slips marked with my name, showing payments made quietly over the years, even notes in my own handwriting. Front porch repair, plumbing line replacement. All of it proof that while my father bragged about his empire, I had been the one keeping the house standing. Proof that every sacrifice I made had been real, even if nobody at that dinner table cared to admit it. I spread the receipts across the table, the way a lawyer might line up evidence. My mother's letter rested in the center, her words anchoring the paper trail. For the first time in years, I didn't just feel bitterness. I felt clarity. "You knew, Mom," I whispered. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "You always knew." The humiliation from the restaurant, from being seated by the restroom, from being mocked like a child who never belonged, all of it shifted. It no longer sat like a weight pressing me down. It hardened into resolve. I gathered the receipts into a neat pile, slid them into a folder I pulled from a drawer. It felt almost ceremonial, as though I wasn't just saving paper, but preparing a case, a defense, or maybe an attack. The room grew quieter as the night stretched on. I turned off the overhead light and left only the lamp on the counter glowing. Then slowly I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old rusted key. I set it on the table beside the envelope and the folder of receipts. They had tried to erase me, but in her own hand, my mother had already written me in. The clock was ticking, and their signatures weren't the only ones that mattered. That thought kept circling my head as I left the box and letter spread across my kitchen table. I didn't sleep much that night, just lay awake with the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sounds of cars outside. By the time the sun came up Monday, I already knew what I had to do. I caught the early bus downtown. My hands gripped the folder of receipts and my mother's letter inside my bag. The ride was quiet, but my chest wasn't. Every turn of the wheels felt like a drumbeat counting down to something I couldn't quite name. The law office stood on the 12th floor of a glass building that reflected the morning sky. I slipped into the lobby, told the receptionist I had business with the estate, and she waved me to a waiting area. The place smelled of polished wood and strong coffee. Lawyers in pressed suits walked past, talking too fast, their shoes clicking on the tile like gunfire. From where I sat, I could see into the conference room through a cracked door. My father's voice carried first, steady and smug. "Everything's clean. No issues on our side." The buyer's lawyer nodded, flipping through a thick packet. "Then we can finalize by Thursday. The wire should be complete. We'll keep it tidy. No delays." Thursday. Just 3 days. My palms grew damp. I shifted in my seat, keeping still so no one would notice me. My chest tightened as if the walls of the office were pressing closer. Then I heard Yvette, Her laugh was sharp, cutting across the polished air. Darvel? He's nobody. Just the hired hand. We let him run errands, but he doesn't matter here. The words burned hotter than the sting of being shoved by the restroom at the dinner. This wasn't just humiliation in front of family. This was on record, in a place where signatures decided what counted and who didn't. I clenched my fists until the skin stretched tight over my knuckles. I wanted to push open the door, to tell her I'd been the one who paid when the estate nearly lost power, when the taxes piled up, when the fences fell. But I didn't. I forced myself to sit still, to listen. The lawyer cleared his throat. Good. As long as no one contests, this will close without a hitch. I pulled a pen from my pocket and started scribbling notes in the corner of my folder. Dates. Words. No contest. Thursday. Hired hand. Every detail mattered now. Every word was a seed I could plant later. The meeting wrapped up with polite handshakes. My father's voice grew louder as they left the room, pleased with himself. I rose from my seat slowly, adjusting my bag on my shoulder. Yvette passed close enough that I caught her perfume. The same heavy scent she'd worn at the dinner. She didn't look at me. To her, I was invisible furniture. But the buyer's lawyer glanced my way. He muttered, almost to himself, "Hope no one contests. It'd be messy, messy." The words stuck. I pressed my lips into a thin smile, holding his gaze for just a moment before walking past. He didn't know I had my mother's handwriting in my bag, that I carried years of canceled checks with my name on them. He didn't know I had a rusted key in my pocket, heavy as iron, reminding me exactly where I stood. In the elevator, I slipped my hand into my pocket and felt the jagged edge of that key. This time, it didn't feel like a reminder of what I'd lost. It felt like a weapon I hadn't yet drawn. When the doors opened, I stepped out into the Houston heat, the traffic roaring down the avenue. I breathed in deep, steadying myself. My family thought I'd stay quiet forever. They thought I was just the hired hand. I whispered under my breath, letting the words settle on my tongue like a vow. Messy is exactly what it's about to be. That night, I walked to the old orchard where my mother planted cherry trees. The streets were quiet, lit only by the dull glow of porch lights and the occasional passing car. My shoes crunched against gravel as I left the bus stop and made my way toward the estate. I hadn't been on that land since my father told me I wasn't worth a cent. The air felt heavy, like it carried both the weight of the past and the taste of endings. I slipped through a side path I'd known since I was a boy, the kind of shortcut you never forget. Workers had already set up floodlights near the front of the property, hammering stakes into the ground to prepare for viewings. I kept to the darker edges, ducking under branches, moving like someone trespassing on land he once called home. When I reached the orchard, the noise from the workers faded. The air smelled of grass just cut, sweet and raw, and a faint trace of blossoms that were stubborn enough to hold on through the season. My chest tightened. And I remembered that same smell from when I was 10 years old, carrying a bucket of water beside my mother while she knelt in the dirt. Her voice came back to me as clear as if she were standing there again. These roots are yours to protect, Darvel, not because they're valuable, but because they're alive. She used to press her hands into the soil, guiding me to do the same. She told me trees remembered kindness, that they grew best for the one who loved them most. I walked slowly down the row, running my hand across the rough bark. My siblings never cared for this place. They thought of the orchard as wasted space, land that could have been paved over or rented out, yet they would profit from its sale. The idea twisted inside me. For a moment, standing there under the fading light, I considered letting it go. What was the point of fighting? They had power, signatures, lawyers. I had boxes of receipts and a memory. Was it really worth the battle? Maybe I could walk away, let them choke on their wealth, and never see them again. The thought tempted me, like a soft chair after years of standing. But then I reached the largest cherry tree, the one my mother planted last, the one she made me promise to water when she got too tired. Its branches stretched wide, casting shadows even in the dim light. I slipped the old rusted car key from my pocket and knelt down. The soil was cool against my palm. I laid the key at the base of the tree. My voice came out low, almost a whisper. "They think I'm worthless, Mom. Just the hired hand, but you knew." You always knew, and I won't let them erase you. I stayed kneeling for a while, letting the silence wash over me. My grief was raw, but inside it, something solid began to take shape. It wasn't about my father's approval anymore. That ship had sailed. It wasn't about the money either. It was about the orchard, the estate, the life my mother poured into this land. That was the legacy, and I couldn't abandon it. I picked up the key again, brushing dirt from its jagged edges. It no longer felt like an insult. It felt like a reminder, a weapon, a token of a war that hadn't even begun. For the first time in years, I didn't think about what my father thought of me. I didn't crave to hear my name spoken with pride at his table. I didn't imagine his hand clapping my shoulder. All I saw was the orchard, the roots, the trees, the promise my mother made me keep. My heart steadied. The estate wasn't just property. It was history, memory, blood, and sacrifice. It was my mother's work, and she had already written me into it in ways no will could erase. I rose to my feet, slipping the key back into my pocket. The orchard swayed gently in the night air, leaves rustling like 1,000 quiet voices agreeing with me. If they wanted war, I said to the trees, to my mother, to myself, they just chose the wrong battlefield. I turned away, walking back toward the shadows, the orchard behind me. The next morning, I opened the records one more time, and something leapt off the page. Sunlight spilled through the blinds of my small apartment, falling across the cluttered table where I had spread out papers the night before. Coffee steamed at my elbow, untouched, already cooling as my focus narrowed to the stack of documents in front of me. The receipts were there: roof repairs, property taxes, landscaping bills, all with my name printed clearly on the checks. I remembered standing in line at the bank, signing each one without a word, while my siblings sipped wine in the dining room of the estate. I had carried the load in silence, and now the evidence lay in black and white. I slid those aside and pulled closer the trust paperwork, the thick folder my mother had left, its corners softened with age. My chest tightened as I ran my hand across her handwriting on the envelope. It was the last connection I had to her voice, her judgment, her care. Line by line, I scanned the pages. I wasn't reading anymore. I was dissecting. I traced every clause, every stipulation. Most of it was standard, the legal jargon I had expected, until I saw it. A single paragraph, half hidden between dense text about property distribution. It read, "Any sale of the estate property shall require the consent and signatures of all living heirs." I froze. My eyes went over the line again, and then again. It wasn't just wishful thinking. It was there, in writing. My mother hadn't left me out. She had secured my place quietly, tucked away where no one had thought to look. For a long moment, I just stared at the words, letting them sink in. Then the shock cracked open into something else, a slow, steady triumph that warmed my chest. They couldn't sell without me. They had mocked me at the restaurant, laughed like I was invisible. But legally, I wasn't just present, I was essential. Still, doubt crept in. Could I be reading it wrong? Could they twist this too, like they had twisted everything else? I reached for my phone and dialed Martin, an old friend who worked in law. We hadn't spoken in months, but when his voice came through, I wasted no time. "Martin, I need you to look at something," I said, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. I read the clause aloud, careful not to miss a word. There was a pause on the line, then his tone shifted. "Darvel, that's not vague. That's binding. If they try to close without your signature, it's fraud." The words hit me harder than I expected. Relief washed over me, but so did the pressure. Timing was everything now. If they pushed the sale through before I acted, the fight would become messier, drawn out, maybe even impossible. I hung up and leaned back in my chair. My fists clenched, then released. Going against my father would mean tearing down what little remained between us. A part of me still feared that the boy in me who had always wanted his approval, who had kept silent at every insult, every dismissal. But silence now would be worse than betrayal. It would be erasing my mother's voice, her foresight, her trust in me. I stood and began to organize the papers, receipts in one pile, Bank slips in another. The letter from my mother on top, as if it were the shield that guarded everything else. Methodically, I slid them into a file folder, each page lined up clean and neat. Then I reached into my pocket, the rusted car key pressed into my palm, its edges biting against my skin. I stared at it for a long moment, remembering the night it had come in the envelope, meant to humiliate me. Now I clipped it to the folder's edge, not as trash, but as a marker, a seal. What had once been an insult was now my weapon. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. My heart thudded with a mix of fear and fire. They wanted a clean closing, I whispered into the quiet of my apartment. I'll give them a messy one. The sound of my own voice lingered, firm and clear, bouncing off the walls like a vow. At the next meeting, I wasn't the only one watching, and neither was my father. The law office conference room smelled faintly of leather and polish, the kind of place built to intimidate. The oak table stretched long and heavy between us, its surface gleaming under recessed lights. My father sat at the head, posture stiff but confident, a stack of documents arranged neatly in front of him. My sister lounged nearby, tapping her manicured nails on the folder she'd brought, every click another reminder that she thought this was already won. I took my seat opposite them, my own folder in hand, the old key clipped to the edge like a secret weapon. The silence pressed down, broken only by the shuffle of papers. Father leaned back, his voice carrying that casual cruelty I'd grown used to. Darvel, you showing up here doesn't change a thing. The estate is moving forward. We're finalizing today. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I slid the folder open and pushed forward a page, the clause my mother had tucked into the trust. My voice was steady, low. You forgot this. Every heir has to sign. That includes me. For the first time in years, I saw something flicker in his expression. The smirk faltered, his jaw tightening before he forced it back into place. My sister leaned forward, eyes flashing irritation. That's a technicality. Nobody cares about your signature. The door opened before I could reply. All heads turned. Orland stepped inside, his shoulders stooped with age, a worn leather notebook tucked under his arm. He'd lived next door to the estate my whole life, a quiet man who kept to himself, yet always noticed more than anyone realized. His presence here was no accident. "Excuse me," he said, his voice rough but steady. I couldn't sit back anymore. Father's brows knit together. "What are you doing here?" Orleen set the notebook on the table and looked at me first, then at him. "I heard you, Lorne, last month when you told Yvette you'd find a way to cut Darvel out, even though his mother wanted him to have the estate. You thought nobody was listening." He tapped the notebook. I wrote it down, word for word. The room went still. My chest tightened, vindication and sorrow colliding. He hadn't just heard whispers. He'd heard the scheme. My father's chair scraped sharply against the floor as he stood. "Lies," he barked. "You're just a neighbor. You don't know what you're talking about." Orland didn't flinch. "I've lived beside this family for 40 years. I know exactly what I'm talking about. And I know what your wife said too, that Darvel was too soft to fight back. She was wrong." My sister jumped in, her words sharp as knives. "You have no business here. You're siding with him because you pity him. He's always been on the outside. He doesn't belong at this table." The sting hit, but I held still. I kept my eyes on the papers in front of me, on the clause, on the truth that no insult could erase. My fingers brushed against the key, its weight grounding me. Finally, I lifted my gaze, my voice calm. "Keep talking. Every word makes it clearer who you are and who you're afraid of." Their laughter faltered. My silence was no longer weakness. It was control. The air thickened, the lawyer shifting uncomfortably in his seat, glancing between us like he wanted to escape. Then my father slammed his hand against the oak table, the sound cracking like a gunshot. "You think a clause in a neighbor will stop me? You think you've won?" His voice shook with fury, spittle catching in the corner of his mouth. The room vibrated with the force of it. But I only leaned back slightly, a faint smile tugging at my lips. For once, he was the one rattled. He forgot one thing. Fraud leaves a trail. And trails, if followed carefully, always lead back to the one who thought they were untouchable. The law office had grown hotter, or maybe it was just me finally letting my anger simmer close to the surface. Papers were no longer stacked neatly. They sprawled across the oak table like evidence at a crime scene. My father's face was flushed, my sister's smugness slipping into unease, and the lawyer in the corner kept tugging at his tie like it was choking him. I reached into my folder and pulled out a thin stack of papers. I laid them on the table slowly, not for drama but for precision. You want to finalize this sale? Then maybe you should explain these. The first sheet was a series of bank transfers, small at first, then larger, hidden beneath vague notations. Maintenance, one said. Another, consulting. But the routing numbers told another story. Money siphoned quietly into a private account under Yvette's name. My sister leaned forward, her voice sharp but wavering. "Where did you get this?" I didn't blink. "From the same estate you all thought I never cared about. Turns out the house keeps records, whether you notice them or not." Her smirk faltered. She looked at my father, waiting for his lead. He didn't disappoint. With a sudden motion, he reached across the table, trying to grab the papers. His hand shook as he snatched at the corner, but I was quicker. I slid them back toward me, keeping my voice low and even. "Fake papers, right? That's what you're about to say." "Of course they're fake." His voice cracked louder than he intended. "You think you can just dig through boxes of junk and pull this stunt?" The tremor in his hands betrayed him, even as his eyes blazed. I set down another document. This one carried his signature, or rather, the version of it that had been traced. The pen pressure was uneven, the flourish unnatural. "Funny thing about signatures," I said. "When you forge them, the ink tells on you." Silence spread across the table like a crack in glass. Even my sister leaned back this time, her confidence unraveling. The lawyer, who'd been mumbling to himself about timelines and technicalities, leaned forward. "This doesn't change." He stopped mid-sentence, eyes narrowing at the page. His fingers traced the date at the bottom. "Wait, this doesn't match. The notarization is from a week after the supposed signing date." My father snapped, "So what? Clerical errors happen all the time." But the lawyer had gone pale, his lips pressed thin, sweat beginning to gather at his hairline. "Not like this. This is fraud." His voice dipped lower, as though he regretted saying it out loud. The weight in the room shifted. For once, I wasn't the one shrinking. I pulled out a final folder, placing it gently on the table, the sound louder than it should have been. On the tab, written in bold black ink, were the words, "To be delivered to authorities if necessary." My father's head jerked toward it, panic flickering in his eyes. "You'd ruin your own family?" His voice wasn't fury anymore. It was desperation laced with that old weapon, guilt. I met his gaze without flinching. "You already did that." The silence that followed was deafening. My sister's voice came in thin and shaky, nothing like her usual sharp tone. "Dad, what is he talking about? You said everything was clean." My father slammed his hand down again, but it no longer carried the same power. The noise rang hollow, like a bluff called out. "Don't listen to him. He's trying to destroy us, to destroy me." I leaned back, folding my arms. My voice dropped, calm as a blade pressed against the skin. "I don't need to destroy you. You did that yourself when you decided your greed was worth more than your integrity." The lawyer coughed, clearing his throat, his face drained of color. "Darvell, could I speak to you privately?" His words were slow, careful, almost pleading. My father's voice boomed immediately, wild and frantic. "Don't you dare! Don't listen to him!" He turned to me, his eyes wild, veins standing out in his neck. "You think you're clever bringing up scraps of paper? You think this will stand? I'll bury you before I let you take one brick of that estate." The room felt brittle, like one wrong move would shatter it entirely. My heart pounded, but not from fear, from clarity. For the first time, my father looked afraid, and that fear was my weapon. For the first time, my father looked afraid, and that fear was my weapon. But fear alone wouldn't finish the fight. I needed the truth, and the truth was already on the table in black and white. The next day, in the courthouse corridor, everything smelled of dust, floor polish, and nerves. The walls hummed faintly with echoes of other families' disputes, but this was ours. My father, pacing like a caged animal, still believed he could intimidate the system the way he had intimidated me all my life. My sister leaned against the wall, mascara smudged from a night of crying. Yvette wasn't even there. Maybe she'd decided the storm wasn't worth weathering. The clerk entered, her heels clicking sharply on the marble. In her hands was a stamped order. She didn't waste words. The sale of the estate is frozen pending investigation. Fraudulent activity has been noted. No authority remains with Mr. Lorne until this matter is resolved. My father spun toward her, face red, veins raised in his neck. You can't do this. That's my house, my name. The lawyer, the same one who had tried to stay neutral yesterday, now stood stiffly, his jaw clenched. Sir, this is beyond negotiation. It's fraud. It's not your call anymore. It was a small sentence, but it hit like a hammer. My father's authority, the thing he wielded like a sword all these years, was gone with one official stamp. He turned to me then, his voice ragged, words dripping venom. You ruined everything. Do you understand that? Everything I built, gone because of you. I held his gaze, steady, not flinching. You didn't build it alone. And what you did build, you poisoned. I just pulled the curtain back. My sister broke then, sliding down the wall into a heap of sobs. What about me? What about my share? She looked up at father, desperate. You promised. He didn't even glance at her. His fury was too focused on me. Two officials stepped forward, placing gentle but firm hands on his arms. That's enough, sir. You'll need to leave now. His final words, shouted over his shoulder as they led him down the corridor, echoed off the marble. You'll regret this, boy. You'll regret it for the rest of your life. But the venom had no teeth anymore. For the first time, his words didn't pierce. They sounded hollow, the last swing of a man stripped bare. I looked down at my hand. The courthouse clerk had given me back the estate keys, heavy and cold. For years, I thought holding them would mean victory, recognition, belonging. But standing there, I felt only their weight. So I walked to the clerk's table, set them down, and said quietly, this place made us enemies. I won't let it own me anymore. No one spoke. The sound of the keys settling on the wood was louder than anything else in the room. Later that afternoon, I drove out toward the coast, where the estate's back fields once stretched down to the water. The orchard wasn't far behind me, but I didn't stop. I went straight to the beach. The gatepost was still there, old wood carved with initials, my mother's and mine. I touched the grooves with my fingers. Years ago, I thought those letters meant nothing, just scratches that would fade. But now, standing there in the wind and salt air, I saw them for what they were, proof that I had always been here, no matter who tried to erase me. The ocean roared ahead, endless and free. I breathed deep, the salt stinging my throat, and felt something loosen inside me. A neighbor walking his dog along the sand paused, lifting a hand. Proud of you, kid, he called. Simple words, but they carried more weight than all my father's speeches ever had. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As the sun slid low and painted the waves in gold, I realized the truth. Justice wasn't about keeping the house. Justice was walking away from the chains it had wrapped around me all these years. Sometimes victory isn't possession, it's freedom. And that was the day I finally became my own man.